Manufacturing is seen as a small sector of the UK economy, only accounting for formally about 10% of UK output, 9% of total employment. But its significance is much greater than that. It accounts for something like 65% of private research and development spend, 45% of exports, and it pays good wages, on average 15% higher wages than average. And it has many links to other sectors in the economy. So here in the West Midlands, for example, if you take manufacturing and then add to that services linked to it, it's something like a third of the economy. Now, that's not absolutely right, but it's roughly right. And it gives you an idea of the importance of manufacturing in this part of the UK. Manufacturing is also very closely linked with the EU. About half of imports and exports of manufactured goods go to and from the EU. Around 10% of the manufacturing labour force is from other EU countries, and that could be as high as 30% in some sectors like food and drink. There are also very tight supply chain links in some sectors with the EU, particularly automotive, where component parts could cross the channel several times before going into a car sold anywhere in the EU or around the world. So disruption to those links with the EU are likely to have very major effects on manufacturing, and because of manufacturing's importance to the wider economy, the UK economy. There's likely to be some regions that are more likely affected by that disruption to manufacturing. We think of the West Midlands in terms of automotive, the Northwest, for example, and certain sectors which are more particularly exposed, like automotive. And there are three sectors actually that account for 40% of our manufacturing output. That's automotive, pharmaceuticals, and aerospace, all of whom have different concerns around Brexit. So what we did in this report, which has been written with Ivan, my colleague at University of Birmingham, lots of input from our UK and a Changing Europe colleagues, thank you for that, is we've looked at kind of all the evidence we can on the impact of Brexit on UK manufacturing, and we've looked at sort of 10 different areas in which Brexit is likely to have an impact. And I'll very quickly sort of summarise those for you. So tariffs is a big issue. In some sectors like aerospace and pharmaceuticals, even with a no trade deal, tariffs are likely to be low or zero because there are WTO agreements in place. But they're likely to be much higher in others. So, for example, with no trade deal, tariffs could be 10% in automotive. Now, that could lead to a very significant hit to output in the UK, reducing demand for UK-made cars, and could lead to a shift in production out of the UK to the EU. Now, Mike might say more on that later, but we'd previously estimated the hit from that kind of no trade deal of about 150,000 cars a year, and then more in the long term if investment decisions went away from the UK. Another factor are rules of origin requirements, and this is about proving where the components, the parts come from. This is a major issue in some sectors, again automotive, whereby if there's a trade agreement, you'd probably expect it to be in the range of 55 to 60% local content to qualify for the free trade agreement. Now, given that the supply chains are so closely interlinked in, say, automotive, UK Auto is some way off there. So it would be difficult to meet that. There need to be what's called a accumulation agreement where UK and European content is counted together. That's still costly to prove as well. So simply tracing where the parts come from down the supply chain and actually justifying, sort of certifying all that could still add about £5 or £6 billion a year to manufacturing costs. Another factor is non-tariff barriers, including things like customs declarations. That alone would hit manufacturing with about £15 billion a year. And the possible disruption to customs could lead to border delays, which makes just-in-time supply chains much more difficult to manage and possibly mean that companies have to stockpile components, adding to costs. Another issue is regulatory alignment. So here, manufacturers are often concerned that divergence is going to be harmful. Now, okay, the UK government sees regulatory divergence in itself as a benefit of Brexit. That's not the way it's perceived by many manufacturers. And they see that as adding potentially to, in terms of lots of costs to what they do. So if, say, a car maker has to show that it meets regulations in the UK and in the EU, that might mean 2 sets of crash testing, which could add considerably to costs. This is a big issue in aerospace, where the UK so far has been part of the European Aviation Safety Agency, in sectors like medicines, but also in chemicals as well. And there are big issues about how that is going to be resolved longer term beyond the transition period. A whole range of other issues as well, things like geographical indications. This is protection for food and drink, which is one of the UK's biggest manufacturers sectors, where food is made in a certain place. How that is going to work out beyond the transition period there's still a considerable amount of uncertainty there. Issues about data protection and also on state aid. So there may be a bigger sort of potential policy space post-transition for the UK, but if there isn't an agreement over that with the EU, that could in turn disrupt our trading relationship. And it should be noted that before COVID-19, okay, we've seen considerable government intervention of late, but before that, the government wasn't using all of the state aid space that was available to it. Other issues include skills. The new immigration rules should allow firms to fill long-term skill gaps, but there are issues here around short-term needs. So an aerospace manufacturer or a car manufacturer gearing up production at a particular plant, needing to bring in labour from other parts of the EU. And certain sectors like food and drink could be hit by the lack of low-cost labour. Research and development is a potential issue, so considerable EU funding comes in through a number of different means, Horizon 2020, for example, but also the European Investment Bank. UK has said it will replace that European funding in the case of Horizon 2020, but here the issues are around the loss of collaborative opportunities with partners and networks across the EU. And a final point is around uncertainty in investment. So the lack of certainty has really stymied investment in certain sectors. So we've seen a big hit to investment in sectors like automotive in recent years. Overall, Brexit is likely to lead to negative effects on manufacturing. And in fact, manufacturing could be one of the worst hit parts of the UK economy, but the size of the impact and the concerns of industry vary by sector. So in terms of different sectors, automotive, and again, Mike may say more on this, are particularly concerned about the impact of possible tariffs in the event of a no trade deal, about issues around rules of origin, regulatory alignment, and there's a concern that there's a risk of potential major output loss if EU market access is lost and just-in-time supply chains are disrupted. In the case of aerospace, the major concern is about regulatory alignment and about whether the UK aerospace industry, which has been very successful, is able to sell into European and markets worldwide. So far, they're able to do that through membership of ESA. And then across all sectors, there's concern about the lack of certainty about data protection rules and the low level of preparations by manufacturers, many of which haven't mapped their data flows yet. So they don't necessarily know what they need to do post-transit. In terms of sort of post-Brexit opportunities, are there potential positives? Well, maybe. With the sort of extra regulatory space the UK has, it could be quicker in establishing regulatory frameworks in things like, for instance, driverless cars, although we're already very good on that. And even there, access to EU markets and supply chains is still seen as critical by industry. There may be scope to reshore more component suppliers in certain parts of manufacturing to encourage more sourcing of local content. And maybe in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be more of an emphasis on supply chain resilience. That's going to need a really dedicated industrial policy to do that. It isn't easy to do. We've done work looking at reshoring and found there are challenges in doing that. But in reviewing the evidence, we found quite a few concrete opportunities identified by industry post-transition. Tate and Lyle are hoping, for example, for the elimination of sugar tariffs on cane sugar and quotas. But that's an unusual, a rare example. And we found little or no benefit from regulatory autonomy or divergence identified by industry. Little reason to believe that exiting the EU will boost exports to non-EU markets around the world, and little or any additional attraction for bringing a foreign direct investment into the UK post-Brexit. So just to finish off, we think that post-Brexit we'll really need to consider industrial policy. Government may need to think about short-term measures to support manufacturing. That could involve potentially part-time wage subsidies, loans, tax or rate deferrals. Some of those were the government has been doing through the COVID-19 pandemic. We might need to think about extending those and maybe making them more flexible. So there's a more sort of part-time wage subsidy system to allow workers to go into work or then go onto some sort of furlough. Longer term, we think the government could consider a more place-based industrial policy, really to promote UK manufacturing in terms of skills, adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies, adapting to green challenges, rebuilding the supply chain. Remember that manufacturing is going to face multiple challenges, not only dealing with Brexit, recovery from COVID-19, the transition to carbon net zero, and also the uptake of these new technologies that are coming. So, post-pandemic sort of support, I think we can think about supporting certain sectors, taking on new different technologies, and also in doing that, thinking about the whole levelling up agenda. So on that note, Anna, I'll finish off.